In the last video, we talked about how Baldur's Gate 3 isn't coming out in 2021, at least in my opinion anyway. But let's talk about some changes that need to happen before this game can actually launch and things that we'd like to actually see in the full game. This video is sponsored by you. If you're going to enjoy this video, be sure to do all that good YouTube stuff, subscribe, like, etc. Starting off with number 1, and I'm going to call this one Custom Player Blandness. Now, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but let me explain. So, now in all RPGs where you can create your own character, and even in Larian's previous Divinity Original Sin games, the main purpose of creating your character is to roleplay as that person. Whether they're a dwarf rogue who likes to kill first and ask questions later, or they're a sweet-talking warlock, or, maybe you're projecting yourself onto that character. An issue that I have with Baldur's Gate 3 is that the custom character that you create feels a little bland, and I don't really get a sense of emotion from the character, or even that they're really portraying the role that I'm presenting for them, if that makes sense. So what I mean is that in a lot of the scenes where you are zoomed down and you're looking at your characters in this very close view, your character is often just standing there or with their arms crossed, or just basically standing there. They're not really doing anything, and I found that there's a disconnect between the dialogue and the role-playing that you're choosing and what your character is actually doing themselves, as they feel a little lifeless in a lot of these scenes. I think this is kind of a byproduct of the new close-up angle in these dialogue scenes, whereas compared to, Larian's previous games, even the Original Sin 2, the narrator can really describe what your character is doing in these scenes, and then you as the player can kind of fill in the blanks and have that real suspense of disbelief. And I feel that with this close-up new angle that we're just getting a lot of close-ups of our character just standing there with a blank face. We're not getting a lot of emotion from the character. It just kind of feels like regardless of the dialogue option you pick, there is no real different reaction in what your character will do. And this is because that you are in those close-up views. So Larian would have to animate any of those actions and what they're actually doing and moving around in the world. And that's a lot harder than just having, the narrator describe these scenes in intricate detail for you. It is kind of a minor thing, but it's just something that bothered me a little bit during my multiple playthroughs. Number 2 is camping and resting. Now, I considered having these as separate points because they are kind of their own thing, but I felt like I should merge them because they are similar enough. Something I have an issue with in the game currently is that resting has no consequence. Long rest or short rest, there is virtually no point in short resting. You can just long rest all the time. Resting needs to have some form of consequence or a limited use. And I know Larian said that you can now short rest twice before a long rest, so you don't have to long rest. But really, there's no point in short resting anyway, because regardless of where you are on the map or what you're doing, you can take a long rest and replenish all of your spell slots. There's no significance to using those spell slots. There needs to be a limit on when you can long rest, or possibly even where you can long rest. If you're delving deep down into a dungeon, you shouldn't be able to just crank out the bedrolls and have a long rest there. Those are the times you should be able to short rest, but you shouldn't be able to long rest, in my opinion. It also feels a little bit at odds because you can long rest pretty much an unlimited amount of times, and during Act 1 of Early Access, you're given a very time-critical task that you have to solve, but you can just constantly sleep all of the time and it doesn't matter. It feels a little bit at odds. So I would like there to be some kind of consequence to the purpose of long resting, and just to give short resting a little bit more of a real purpose, because at the moment it doesn't really have one. And also the issue I have with the campsite is that it is the same regardless of where you are in the map. So, you can be down in these deep, dark tunnels, and when you camp, you're just instantly above ground in this nice waterfront camp location. It's just that, again, that suspension of disbelief that I would really like Larian to look at. So, even if you could, long rest down in these locations, maybe when you do long rest, you are actually in like a campsite that is underneath the ground in like a dungeon similar to that. It doesn't have to be, for every location, there has to be a specific camp, but when you are traveling between these different areas, like the Underdark, like caves, like the above ground, that there is different campsites based around that. Next is dialogue outcomes and the freedom you have as the player. For the most part, I am pretty happy with the role-playing and the dialogue options in the game. I think they're one of the most solid points that we do have in the game currently. But what I'd like Larian to look at is other ways to resolve these conversations or quests other than just either a skill check or combat. I feel like every situation breaks down into these two categories right now. The skill check option was pretty lackluster when the early access first came out, as you didn't get any experience or rewards for avoiding combat, which Larian themselves are working to tune so that if you do, avoid combat via a skill check, you do get some rewards for that. But it'd be nice to see a way that there is other ways of getting some of these items that these characters have. A good example that I can think of is the trolls that you come across in the Goblin Village. One of the trolls has this intelligence headband, which is really overpowered for the early access. If you're running a wizard, you kind of have to run it anyway. The downside here is that you have really two options, or one option if you want the headband. If you want the headband, you just have to kill the troll and take the headband. You can't pickpocket it from them. There's no other way to get it from the troll in any of the dialogue options or anything like that. And if you do want to actually go the other route and not kill the trolls, which in a way you should, because they are super powered and you can actually get them as just like a summonable, so you can summon them in any combat and they will just wreck shop. They're powerhouses, but it was just too much of a cut and dry option 1 and then option 2. And I feel like there needs to be some kind of gray area in between there as different ways to resolve some of these conversations. Especially, it would be hilarious if, you're talking to that troll, they're super intelligent and somehow you take the intelligence handband away from them and then they're just like a dumb troll like the rest of them. There is some comedic effects there, and even in other situations, I feel like there's some really good options that Larian can look at. Next, we have combat, and man, combat in Baldur's Gate 3 is slow. Combat is probably the biggest thing that I feel like needs to be updated. I did the main quest outcome where you fight the entire druid camp, and no joke, that whole area took me over an hour to actually just do that portion of the quest. I streamed it and I was playing a co-op, so maybe it took me a little bit longer than anyone else, but it was just so long. I'm not saying it wasn't enjoyable, but the enemy turns take forever, and when you've got so many enemies all in the one combat encounter, you are constantly just sitting there waiting for the AI to make their turns, and you only really get control for a couple of minutes. And because of the way the combat works in Baldur's Gate 3, you complete all of your actions at once if you are having your allies that have the same initiative. So you get the control for maybe 2 minutes, you complete all of your actions, and then it goes back to the AI for 5-10 minutes while you just sit there and wait for them to do all of their various actions. Don't get me wrong though, like the combat is enjoyable. I have had a good time. It's just that in these bigger encounters, there really needs to be a way that you can speed it up. Whether it's just, a clickable where, combat runs at a normal pace, you click this option and it just like zooms through the AI's turn, or even a way that they take all of their turns at the same time, kind of like how you can, just a way to speed that process up. And from memory, the average encounter in Baldur's Gate 3 is larger than Divinity Original Sin 2, which is fine, but it means more enemies, more turns, and more AI to wait for. Just would really like this process to be a little bit faster, and just so we can get to the main fun of turn-based combat, which is actually making the actions yourself rather than waiting on the AI. The last one on this list is a question for you guys. If you've played the early access, I'd like you to think back. How many dungeons are in this Dungeons and Dragons game? I can really only think of one that I'd consider to be like an actual dungeon. We have a ton of dragons, just not many dungeons. What I'd like is more optional dungeons or even like little delves to explore, with hopefully some spicy loot at the other end. Something that I felt was missing in the early access, and almost all of the content is tied to a quest. There isn't necessarily anything that is just an optional, completely unrelated to questing experience. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but some more options to just explore and find interesting areas and interesting gear would be something that would be enjoyable. And I felt during my playthrough, I was wearing the same armor and weapons for most of the early access. And I mean, that's pretty typical for a Dungeons and Dragons experience, but considering this is a video game, I like my loot, and I like a lot of loot. And the way that you could really put this into the game is these optional dungeons that, maybe you find a hidden door or whatever, and it's not really linked to a quest. You just go there, you fight some enemies, you might get a loot at the end or something like that. So more hidden dungeons would be really interesting to implement, and it would be a good idea for players that are trying to avoid combat in all of the dialogue options as a way to introduce them and get them a little bit of combat to mix up their gameplay, just so that they're not, in dialogue options all the time. These are just complete off to the side random things that, you're just killing wolves or something that's completely unrelated to any quest line. This is just off to the side. And there is a world map, and we do get a brief look at it at the end of the early access, so maybe this is a way they could implement some of those optional dungeons, kind of like in Pillars of Eternity 2, how you do when you're traveling around the map, you do have locations that you can go to for a little bit of side content. I'd be really interested to know what you guys think about Baldur's Gate 3 and what changes you would like to see to the game. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch. There goes the cat. Please follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and on Twitch, where I stream every Tuesday and Thursday Australian night times. Hope to see you guys there in the next stream. Thank you for watching this video. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.